Hi, I'm Joseph Ellis. Thank you for joining us again for another season of Wingate Spotlight. I'm an assistant professor of political science here, and we're going to start off our new season with hopefully a lot of new faces, folks that you may have seen in the community and perhaps not. And today we are joined by Kevin Winchester, director of the Writing Center and an English instructor here at Wingate. And Kevin, glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we like to do is get to know you personally in the first half and then professionally in the second half. So let's start with the personal questions, if we will. Where are you from?
I'm from Union County. I'm a native. I was born in Monroe and grew up just west of Monroe. I went to high school at Sun Valley. So I'm a native. Been here most of my life. I lived away for several years, but yeah, most of my life.
I grew up on the other side of the 74 Porter Ridge. Well, didn't grow up, but I live there now. So.
Okay.
What did your family do?
Basically, we're blue collar. My grandfather on my father's side was a farmer, worked in the school system, to that sort of thing. My dad was employed by Western Electric for most of my childhood, which eventually they were sold a couple of times, ended up being Verizon. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom, typical childhood. The area was not nearly as populated then, so we spent our summers outdoors and that sort of thing. So it was a very very rural upbringing, I guess. You know, nothing like the area where we grew up is just on the other side of the mall, and where Target and everything are located now. So it's a big change. I've seen a lot of change.
So when you drive by a Target, do you reminisce? Do you mourn? What is the reaction?
It's not. It's strange. It's not really I'll reminisce, but it's not so much an idea of mourning it, because just everything changes, and I'm used to that. I'm comfortable where we are now is a little more rural. I don't envy that, because a lot of good things have come from the growth. So I don't have any ill will towards that. But sometimes it's a little. If I ride through what is now a neighborhood, yeah, I think about some of the things that we did as kids, and playing there. But it's all a part of. It's just the way of life, So I'm accustomed to the change. In this part of the state, you see so much of it that I don't think much about it anymore.
Sure, and I believe Union County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state, in the country. Maybe.
Absolutely.
You mentioned farm life. What sort of farming activities would have gone on in your community or on your all's farm? Or
it's what we were never big farmers. The joking term we always use is truck farmers. We had a very large garden. My granddad had always had some cows, some chickens, hogs, that sort of thing, but never commercial. It was always, we were, I guess, trying to be self-sufficient there as well as we could. And most of our families, my aunts, uncles, everybody else, we would all eat out of the same garden. And usually we would have our pork and meat and chicken and eggs and everything else came from it, but we were never commercial farmers. So it was, everybody always had another means of income. So
right. And you were doing the slow food and organic movement before it was trendy, or before they even, it was just farming.
Yeah, it was, I joke about how that used to be. One of the, actually it was the first thing that I ever really had published was a poem. And the poem was about, I called it an ode to recycling, and it was about a pig named Irwin. Because what we used to do, I'll never forget this, we kept a slop bucket, which was outside, and we would put our scraps, and then we'd go to my grandparents, and we would always carry the slop bucket to feed the hogs. And I always, in my poem, I said we were one of the first recyclers, because before it was ever popular, because yeah, it was the same thing. You'd slop the hog, and then, come fall, you were eating the bacon. So yeah, it was. We didn't think anything about it. It was not anything like the movement. It was just what you did. Everybody around here did it at the time.
Yeah, growing up on a farm myself, I'm very familiar with the slop bucket.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as a garbage disposal in our house.
No, you made use of everything.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So you grow up in Monroe, you go to high school, you get out of high school. What are your options? What are you thinking?
Well, I wasn't really sure. I was, that was, at that point in time, it was the late 70s, and computers were nothing like they are now. So the big push, it seemed to be, well, if you want to go into business, you want to learn about computers. You know, you want to be pretty well versed in business management. So without a real definite plan, and I'm a first generation college student, nobody in my family had gone to college, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. Naturally, Wingate seemed like a good choice. I applied to other schools, was accepted to other schools, but Wingate just seemed to fit at that particular time. And I came to school here to study business management. And that was about the time Wingate had moved from a 2-year program to a 4-year college. It was Wingate College then. I did not participate in the 4-year program. I was in the 2-year program by my own volition, I suppose. And studied business management, but I had always, you know, people look at me sort of strange and say, well, you were in business management. And I was in business before I ended up back here, you know, on the faculty and staff. And I was always interested in writing. I was a very, very avid reader from the time I was a child, and telling stories and being told stories and that sort of thing. So it was always a bit of a strange fit being in a business program when that was my desire. I still have actually a couple of books from when I was in the classes, and I'd flipped through one of them several years ago. And I noticed that I was writing story ideas and poetry and that sort of thing in the margins of my econ book and my business law book, which I'm sure Dean Haskins would not appreciate it, but that was sort of what I was doing. But spent 2 years taking business classes.
And did you appreciate, Wingate at that time was still kind of a sleepy town school, still very rural.
Absolutely.
It didn't have a large international presence, at least yet, the way it does now. So was it a lot of folks from your high school? I mean, who were the people you were going to school with?
There were you knew a lot of the people. There were probably, there were a dozen, I would say, students from my high school that came to school here. What would happen a lot of times, because it was a transitional period from a 2-year to a 4-year school, a lot of folks would come here for 2 years and then go somewhere else. They would transfer. They'd come to Wingate and get their basic credits, and then they'd transfer, to some other place. So a lot of students that I went to high school with were here, but at the time there were only five high schools in the county. And the county was much smaller, and you knew people at most of the high schools, you know, from different avenues. So you'd see a lot of those. Union County population was sort of equivalent to what the campus community was, and we had some from surrounding areas, you know, the surrounding counties. So it felt like you were meeting people from a long ways away. I know the friend I had when I was here the first time he was here from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it was almost culture shock, because it was the first person that I'd ever gotten to know that was not from this area.
He could have been from Mars.
Yeah, at that point. Very few international, if there were international students here at that time, I didn't know them. Nothing like it is now.
Sure.
It's a lot of difference.
So did you take a 2-year degree from Wingate?
No.
You did not?
No.
You leave Wingate in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. Where do you go?
From there, I had the notion that I wanted to play music. I was playing in bands, so I said, well, you know, I'm taking some time to do that. Well, it takes money to do that sort of thing. So I felt like I wanted to work. I said I need a job. I wasn't like I said, it wasn't the right fit. I wasn't happy in the business courses. So being 19, 20 years old and not being extremely thoughtful as far as what my future might hold at that point, I said, well, I'll go to work in business to make some money. And worked for several companies, moved out of the area just because of work, and managed to work my way through that into middle management. So I was working middle management, and I ended up back in this area. And I worked for Yale Security, which is just up the road. I was in middle management there, supervisor of the production control department, and I did that for several years. And the whole time that I was doing that, I really started to feel that pull. I kept writing, kept doing creative things, and I just felt that pull to do something more with that. And that's the point in time. I was actually at Yale when I started to come back to Wingate the second time to major in English.
And the second time you come back, you finish a 4-year degree?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there a family situation at this point?
At that point, yes, I'm married and have a child. So,
Okay.
so yeah, and I was working full time, and actually working a part-time job as well. So I had 2 jobs, a family, and at the time, my son would have been about 10 or 11 years old. So yeah, it was a full plate, and I had a very understanding and hardworking wife. She helped out a lot.
Well, those are useful things.
Oh yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Let's try to figure out how you got back to Wingate for this time.
Okay.
You have a 4-year degree from Wingate.
Yep.
You come back 10, 15 years later as the Writing Center Director.
Yep.
What happens in the meantime?
Well, it's kind of funny. When I came back the second time, my wife's father, my father-in-law, owned an auction company, and it all sort of fit together. He happened to see, he went to a Charlotte Sociables dance, didn't know this at the time, but my band was playing for the dance, and he realized that I was comfortable on stage in front of people. So he says, why don't you come to work for me in the auction company? So I did, and I got my auctioneer's license, and eventually I left Yale and I went to work with him, and then he retired, and we actually bought him out, and I ran the auction business for a while. And I kept writing, and I published a few stories. I went back to, decided I wanted to go to graduate school to get a terminal degree, my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, because I really wanted to pursue that. The older I got, the stronger that urge became, and the more I was writing. And just stroke of luck, Bob Doak, Dr. Doak, called one morning. I was at work with the auction company, and the phone rang, and he reintroduced himself and said, we have a situation where one of our professors just left, and this was in August. And he says, would you be interested in teaching an adjunct course? And I thought, well, you know, I've never taught. I'm a writer. And I told him, I said, I'm not sure I can do that. And he says, no, we'll set you up with a mentor. You know all of us. You know, we'll get you through this. So I ended up teaching one adjunct course just to help out that fall, and loved it. It was. I said, yeah, I think this is what I should be doing. And then from that point, I started making arrangements, and I wanted to get out of the auction business, and I wanted to pursue, you know, being involved in academia. I taught here as an adjunct for a couple of years, and then I went to UNCC, and then the opportunity arose once they started talking about the Writing Center. I came back on as a visiting lecturer for a year. And then the Writing Center opened, and I had applied for that position, and that's what brought me here.
The rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, that was it.
Well, let's stop here. This is a good chance to take a break. We know some personal things about you. I can't imagine many people have made the transition from auctioneer to English professor and writing director, but you did that. And we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll join Kevin Winchester and talk about his professional activities here at Wingate University. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Dr. Regina Benjamin, U.S. Surgeon General. As a family physician, I know that living with a long-term health problem such as diabetes, high blood pressure, or asthma is not easy. But patients who take control of their own health can live a long and full life. Talk to your doctor to understand your health condition and what you can do to manage it. Don't put your future at risk. Take your medication as directed. Learn more at scriptyourfuture.org.
Welcome back to Wingate Spotlight. I'm Joseph Ellis, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Wingate University. I'm joined today by Kevin Winchester, Director of the Writing Center. And so far we know that Kevin's done a lot of things. He comes to Wingate once, he comes to Wingate twice. He sells cattle for a bit, or auctions cattle for a bit, then comes back to Wingate as Director of the Writing Center. The first question I would have is, you're interacting with people at Wingate now in different capacities at different points in your life. I imagine Sylvia Littlesweat was there when you were there the first time.
Absolutely.
Beverly Christopher was there. People that you would have known. Bob Doak would have been there as well.
Sure.
So what is that transition like? You go from your superior to your colleague.
It was, in the beginning, it was strange. I came in and I worked very closely with John Sykes, Dr. Sykes, the first year, to just get through managing the classroom and that sort of thing. And it was, I think it was stranger for me than perhaps it was for them, because it was just, it was a little different, but I think it was easier because when I came back the second time and I got to know them, I was a non-traditional student. At that point in time, I was well beyond the age of the traditional student. So that helped a little bit in the transition. And by the time I came back, the hairline was receding and the gray hair had started. So I think it was a little easier to make that transition. But it was different. It was a little strange in the beginning.
And you had mentioned in the previous segment that the Writing Center was created when you got here, or?
Yes, we did not have a writing center per se. We had the tutoring center, the ARC, and there were English tutors within the ARC, and those are all the subject tutors. And just by natural flow of things, they ended up tutoring writing, but we didn't actually have any specific separate training or a separate center. And that was, at the time, there was nothing in the location where we are, that all belonged to the library. So they closed that area in. We started, and I trained the tutors, and we had to do some advertising and that sort of thing to officially announce that we did indeed have a writing center. My thought during the interview process and initially that first year, I said it would really take us probably 4 years to see the full benefit and to see usage.
And what year is this?
This is the third full year.
And what year? 2000?
Would have been 2008.
Okay.
Was the first year.
Okay.
The year before, when we had English tutors, for the entire year, they recorded, I think the number was 62 sessions. Tutoring sessions for writing. The first year we had about 1,600, so that was quite an increase, and it was just that. Linda Stage Larson and I joke, if you build it, they will come. It was a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
And this year, being the third year, we're seeing, the first year we saw mostly freshmen because the English department strongly recommended that those students come, so we saw a lot of them. But now we've retained a lot of those, and last year we saw mainly sophomores and freshmen. This year we had, and typically in that situation, it would take about 2 weeks when that first paper was due before we saw our first student come in for a session. This year we had a junior show up the third day of classes, and our numbers are up this year. I know our intern was totaling up, and I think we're going to set new records every month this year already because we're seeing a lot of increased traffic.
Wow. You hear frequently about writers barricading themselves off in solitude in writing, but I would think that writing would be a very discursive process, a lot of talking about writing, and I imagine that's what you experience at the Writing Center, people
Absolutely.
Talking about writing.
Absolutely. Usually what we have our tutors do, and my position is that writing is a process, it's an ongoing process, and the way we ask our tutors to start a session is by having a conversation, just to try and think through with the student writer, what ideas do you want to get on the page. A lot of times it seems that students are intimidated by the process, and even more, they don't even think of it as a process, and they can talk through what they want to say, and that doesn't come through on the paper. So that's where we like for our writing tutors to begin, to see if, all right, here are your ideas, how successfully did you get those on the page, and how well does that meet the requirements that the assignment calls for.
Sure. Well, I want to put you through a couple of scenarios,
sure.
All right, if you would allow me to. Normal scenarios that you would face as a Writing
Sure.
Center director. So I'm an international student, I know exactly what I want to say, but I don't possess the English language skills to do so. How can you help me?
Well, that's because of our increased numbers of international students, that's something that we have to deal with on a relatively regular basis. Usually what we'll do when the student comes in, again, it's conversational, so we try and talk through that. The other thing that we do, we have several textbooks and reference books in our area that help mainly for the tutors, and a lot of times there are tendencies that we'll see when a non-native speaker tries to write. There are issues typically with articles because that's different. There's also usually some difficulty with tense agreement. And that's just a couple of examples, but there are other tendencies in writing. And usually they'll pull out different tutorials or have a discussion. We use different online services. We have different handouts that can help especially for the ESL student, because there's been research that identifies that transference, is the problem. And it lies in that area of typically the non-native speaker, they hear the voice in their head and it's in their native language. And it's almost an issue of translation. So we try and get them beyond that, and hopefully over time that student learns to think in English so that the thoughts are easier to get on the page.
Sure, sure. Here's another dilemma I think all faculty deal with. A student comes to you and says, I get A's on all my papers and I got a D on your paper. Writing's so subjective.
Yeah.
And you say what to that?
Well, to a degree it is. Writing is subjective, and the thing that students, and when I say student writer, this is I call it a rookie mistake. Usually the first thing that they want to forget or that they fail to remember is they're always writing for an audience. I stress to students in my classes and in the Writing Center, you have to think about the audience. Go back and look at the prompt. And yes, it's subjective, but in the prompt, that professor's telling you what they want. And I encourage them to try and first, and we even have handouts, how to understand the writing prompt that helps them get to the core of, here's what I need to do in this assignment. It is subjective, but there are a lot of issues about writing that aren't subjective. If you have a comma splice in a couple of different paragraphs, even though, for instance, in political science, you may not be talking about comma splices, but you know that damages the critical thinking process and just the communication on the page. So whether you inherently say, I'm going to take off 10 points for a comma splice, it still affects the grade. And we try and convey that just to make sure that the students don't compartmentalize writing, that it's important in all the classes, not just in their English class.
Yeah, I think the audience idea is a good thing to remember.
Yeah.
You can talk about professional athletes in a way that you can't talk about high school athletes.
Absolutely.
So the context
Absolutely.
of those things matter. I'm curious to know what you like to write about. I'm a little embarrassed to say I haven't read any of your short stories. I probably should have before I interviewed you, but I'm curious to know what it is that you like to write about.
It's I'm a Southerner, so I write Southern fiction.
Okay.
My short story collection really focuses, you mentioned in the earlier section about the change, that has occurred in this area geographically. So most of my fiction focuses on that, of how there's something about being Southern that it's unique in a way that's difficult to explain. There's an attachment to the land that maybe other people from other regions don't have. And there are just some tendencies there that lend itself to fiction, and I think that a lot of people that have been in the South for several generations are still struggling with this idea of the New South. And most of my fiction tries to address that in some fashion. My later work, I've moved from short stories now, and I'm working on longer fiction, novels. And the novels are they're a little more postmodern, they're a little darker, but it still seems to deal with that same area. It's just people struggling with the world around them. And not even to a degree of change, but just, of being Southern, but that idea of change, how we cope with change.
Sure. I talk to my students a lot about Charlotte. In 1962, Charlotte had about 80 to 90,000 people.
Right.
Now it has 750,000.
Right.
And imagine you're a 12-year-old kid living in Charlotte in 1962.
Oh, it's
and now you're
yeah.
50, 60 years old. It's a brave new world.
Exactly. It causes a lot of issues, and well, not issues, but it causes a lot of questions to arise that normally wouldn't if you lived, say, if you grew up in not even the Midwest, but maybe the mountain region. I have friends that live in Colorado and Wyoming and in areas like that. It's still very rural, a very small town. They grew up in that area, towns of 1,500 to 1,800 population, and it's still that way. So they're not confronted with the same sort of questions that people in this area especially, and most of the South are confronted with. once the air conditioning was perfected, then things changed in the South. It's everybody wanted to live here, and it causes things to be viewed in a different way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And as a Southerner, I'd also say food, music, and race are probably three other defining features of the South that you don't have in other parts of the country.
Absolutely. And that it's kind of funny because people ask, what things are going to appear, and usually that's it. Not so much. Race does appear because I don't really write about race, but race appears because you can't separate yourself from that in the South. It's just a part of the way we live. Now there are obviously negative aspects to that, but then food and music, it's almost impossible for me to separate any of those things. I think, there are some very specific stories that center around music, and my short story collection's called Everybody's Gotta Eat, so there's definitely a food thing running through that. So yeah, I think that's very accurate.
Sure. Where do you see the future of the Writing Center at Wingate? When you think about what you want to do in the next 10 years or 5 years, what do you want to see this become?
I'd like to see us raise the level, I guess, of our certification process. Now, our tutors can be certified now. Most writing centers have gone to a 4-credit class where their tutors actually go through that class, and it establishes just a slightly more professional tutor. And I'd like to do that because what I see the writing tutor becoming is more of an information tutor, information literacy tutor, because there's a need to manage not only the words, but there's a need to manage the format of getting those words on a page, working with not just a paper, but maybe PowerPoint presentations, different ways of using technology and how that changes. The research tools, I think that is a skill set that we could build in our writing tutors so that they're a little more all-encompassing, so that they're not just looking at the writing, they could also assist the library area as far as some research tutoring, to speak to the issue of, okay, here are the writing issues that we need to address, but you also need a little more support. We need to go find some more evidence. Let's suggest, these databases, so they know a little bit more about using the technology and putting that in place. That's one area, and another area I'd really like to see increase is the number of international students is increasing. So I'd like to establish at some point a certification for at least one or two of our tutors, so that they could go maybe in the summer and get certified as an ESL instructor. I think that would be very beneficial, to let them specialize just a bit.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, but it can only be a word. All the new technology, the iPads, the iPhones, the computers, the internet, has this made your job easier or harder?
Harder.
Harder.
Harder. Unfortunately, what I see in a lot of students, they're comfortable with certain aspects of the technology, but they don't see technology as a tool, and that's what it is. And from somebody that's learned technology as I go through life and haven't grown up with it, that's you have to cross that barrier, I think, to be successful. And it's important for the student, I believe, to develop those skills in a way that doesn't bind them to the constraints that technology wants to bind them to. In other words, there's more that you can do with a computer or a smartphone or an iPad than checking Facebook. You can use that as a definite tool.
Sure.
And that, for some reasons, it's difficult, to get past that.
Okay. Kevin, thanks for joining us today. Thank you for joining us on Wingate Spotlight. I'm Joseph Ellis, Assistant Professor of Political Science. We were joined today by Kevin Winchester, Director of the Writing Center. Join us next week for hopefully Magdalena Krajewska, our new Assistant Professor of Political Science. Thank you.